Howdy, historians, historians, howdy, how are you today? Howdy, historians, let's learn some history. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Howdy, historians, Mr. Montgomery. Going to continue on with our look at the Civil War. We are looking at Unit 5, Part 2. All right, so, no, we're not doing that. No, here we go. All right, Unit 5, Part 2, the Civil War. We're going to go through these slides together eventually in class. I just kind of look at some of these pictures with you, and we chat about some of the big ideas of the war. But we'll do that in class. It's more effective in person. But I want to talk about today is the beginning of the war. So here we're going to see the opening shots, the firing and on and bombardment of Fort Sumter. Artist depiction here. What it actually looks like here. We'll come back and take a look at that picture in a little bit and see how the war begins, then how there's another wave of secession. 4 more states will join the original 7, and then we'll talk about the importance of the border states as well, and all of this matches up with your lecture outline. So think about having it out. Help keep yourself organized. Okay, here we go. Now, the war begins. Remember, we're talking about Southern secession here. All right, South Carolina, December 20th, 1860, they seceded from the Union. And then by February, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Florida have followed suit. The Confederate States of America have been established. Eventually, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas say, we will join you if there's aggression. All right, so if there's some type of aggression, we will join you in your secession, and we also will leave the United States. And we will form the Confederate States of America with you. Right? So there's these 2 waves. The blue states go before the fall of Fort Sumter. The gray states will come in after. The Union states are in the red. They stay loyal the whole time. And then the blue states are border states that never go. All right, we'll come back and take a look at that again in a second as well. You know, and many Southerners accepted secession enthusiastically. Some Southerners were more reluctant to accept secession, as we talked about last time. You know, there are some justifications for it, but also, you know, Democrats still controlled the Senate. Democrats still basically controlled the Supreme Court, even though, you know, of course, our Supreme Court is supposed to be apolitical, non-political. It was a conservative Supreme Court. We know that from the Dred Scott decision. All right, and Lincoln himself, he had kind of spoken both ways. He had stated that he did not intend to dissolve slavery. He had also called slavery evil. But he said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. So he wasn't necessarily a fire-breathing abolitionist. He was more a man of the Constitution and anti-expansion. But the Southern fear of the Northern's industrial economy and its increasingly anti-slavery stance struck fear into the Southern elites. You know, the influence of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Fugitive Slave Act and impending crisis of the South, all of these things, Bleeding Kansas, you know, made the North more prone to abolition, and that made the planter aristocracy more nervous, more defensive, and pushed the South more towards secession. And it's important to understand, too, that as the South secedes, it really was the planter aristocracy. It was the elites of the South that had the most to gain or the most to lose. The number of citizens in the South who owned more than 200 slaves in 1850. All right, so number of Southerners owning more than 200 slaves in 1850 is only 254 people. That's 0.004% of the population. The number of white citizens, there's 8 million white Southerners. Okay, 8 million. So the number owning 200 or more slaves, only 254. Out of the 8 million white Southerners, those who owned up to 20 slaves, 46,000. That's 0.83% of the population. That's not even 1% of the population. All right, so it's a very, very small percent of the Southern population that owned slaves. Only about 25% historically of all the Southern white population, only about 25% historically owned slaves. The vast majority did not. And they were making some money off slavery, but honestly, even the profitability of slavery was going down. To feed, house, and clothe the slave for 1 year in 1860 cost the modern equivalent of about $900. and then that slave made you about $2,200. So it was still profitable, but you had to have an enormous amount of slaves to really see the profit. So it was the smallest amount. It was the plant aristocracy who stood to lose the most by staying in the Union, or gain the most by joining and forming the Confederacy. But even in that, just with some of those numbers we're seeing, it wasn't as profitable as I think maybe we think. And then on the flip side, as Southern secession is occurring, many Northerners didn't believe this was real. They didn't really believe that it was permanent secession. They thought that the goal was more like a bluff to gain compromises. But then we quickly realize with Fort Sumter that things are about to get heated. All right, so during the lame duck days of Buchanan's presidency, the Confederacy had been seizing federal land and federal forts. So in every state, there are federal forts. So the state doesn't actually own the land, the federal government owns that land, and they have military bases there. So during the lame duck days of Buchanan's presidency, the Confederacy had been seizing the federal land and the federal forts, and Buchanan did nothing to stop it. And one of the few remaining forts in the South as Lincoln comes into office is Fort Sumter. Okay, you can see a modern picture of it here. And if we look on this larger map, you can see it's off the coast of South Carolina. All right, and as Lincoln took power, it's Fort Sumter is one of two forts that still were manned by U.S. forces and had not been taken over by the Confederacy. Lincoln did not want to give up these forts. But he also did not want to be seen as the aggressor or put on some large or aggressive show of force. He can't be seen as the big bad North coming to, lay chaos and ruin to the South. He's got to find a way to maintain these forts and to keep them under federal power without being too aggressive. He also really does not want to fire the first shot of the Civil War, because then he looks super aggressive and kind of tyrannical, right? And he wants it to look more like, I'm just the guy that's protecting the country, protecting the Constitution, defending the Union. So what Lincoln decides is that he's just going to simply resupply these forts. He's going to resupply Fort Sumter, send down food and water by ship. And if the Confederacy refuses it, then let them be seen as the aggressors, right? But it's not like he's resupplying them with men or fortifying them or fighting for them. Lincoln decides instead he's going to simply resupply the forts, and if the Confederacy refused, they'd be seen as the aggressors, and then the North would be able to take aggressive military actions without being seen in a totally negative light. So on April 4th of 1861, Lincoln ordered a relief expedition to be sent to Fort Sumter. And on the same day, he notified the governor of South Carolina that this relief mission was being carried out, that they were sending supplies to the fort, right? And because it's an island fort, they'd be doing this by boat. So April 4th, 1861, the relief expedition goes out. Lincoln also sends a letter saying, hey, this isn't aggressive. This isn't, a Trojan horse. We're just simply resupplying the fort. However, the South viewed this relief mission as a hostile act. And as the relief ships entered into the harbor on the morning of April 12th, the South began a 40-hour bombardment of Fort Sumter. And the fort, was built for this. It was ruined, right? It had taken a massive beating during this bombardment. But as it was going on, the person in charge there, Major Robert Anderson, did his best to hold the fort, but eventually they have to surrender the fort. This picture is taken after the surrender. That's from inside Fort Sumter. That's the first time that the Confederate flag had flown over a piece of federal land. And you can see the early Confederate flag is very different than the one that will come later. So it's April 12th, 1861 that the war begins. The bombardment lasts 40 hours. And on April 14th of 1861, the bombardment of Fort Sumter is over. The federal troops surrender the fort. And now the Civil War has begun. So in response to this, Lincoln has some work to do. Lincoln now understands that the war has begun. And his response after the attack on Fort Sumter, he took unprecedented actions that he defended by drawing upon his powers as commander-in-chief and chief executive. So he did three things in his response to the bombardment of Fort Sumter. One, he called for 75,000 volunteers to form an army to put down the insurrection in the South. Two, he authorized spending for the war. Three, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Okay, so 75,000 volunteers to make an army to put down the, quote, insurrection in the South. 2, he authorized spending for the war. 3, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Now, what that means is that prisoners could be held indefinitely without any charges being brought against them. And he did that basically so that way he could take people who were fighting against the Union as prisoners of war without declaring war. He never wanted to actually really declare war, because then that would recognize the legitimacy of the South, that they were an independent confederacy of, Confederate States of America. So he wants to be able to hold citizens without charge and keep them basically like prisoners of war, right? And he did all of this, the volunteers, the suspending the writ without congressional approval. Congress was not in session. And he said these measures were indispensable to public safety. So as his power as commander-in-chief and chief executive, he did this. Now, for the response to this for the North, it really did galvanize the North against the South. Northerners were both outraged and shocked by the aggressive action shown at Fort Sumter, and most Northerners believed the South had gone too far and negotiations weren't really viable anymore. And for the South, they were happy with this, most of them, right? For them, it was like, hey, it's about time we take it to these tyrants of the North. There's a famous diary of this Southern woman throughout the Civil War named Mary Chestnut. She talks about watching the bombardment of Fort Sumter from her balcony in Charleston and applauding. There were watch parties for the bombardment as they toasted mint juleps for it. And now the war is on. Lincoln has his response, and both sides are starting to really formulate themselves. It's at this time that we see the second wave of secession, because now there has been aggression, because now there has been a hostile act. Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia all joined the Confederacy, and now the Confederate States of America are formed. Virginia was the big one. They were the most populous of the southern states, and they're going to be kind of the crown jewel of the Confederacy. So it's very important that they came in. But there were also those border states. There were 4 slaveholding states: Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. They had slaves, but they didn't join the Confederacy. Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. Some were due to Union sentiment. They want to stay in the Union. Some were because we didn't allow them to secede, like Maryland. Maryland wasn't allowed to secede because Washington, D.C. is in Maryland. So Maryland was filled with secessionist sentiment, but it surrounded the federal capital, so it had to be kept in. So martial law was actually put in place to keep Maryland in. Even when Lincoln was going to D.C. for his inauguration, they foiled a number of assassination plots in Maryland. They had to change his route 7 different times because they foiled 7 different assassination plots. Missouri was pretty divided. Missouri was kind of a little mini Civil War onto itself. There were lots of federal troops there. Kentucky tried to stay neutral. They actually proclaimed their neutrality, and Lincoln tried to observe that as much as he could. And Delaware just said, yeah, we have slaves, but we're keeping it out. Now, these border states were vital. They were very, very important. One, if the border states were lost, it would have increased the South's population by 50%. A lot of wars are a numbers game, right? Who has the most men to lose? It's kind of a cruel, bloody form of math. So the border states would have increased the South's fighting population by 50%. You can't lose them there. The border states would have also eliminated strategic positions that were vital to the North's war effort. These border states allowed the North kind of like staging areas like Maryland and Delaware to be able to go in and fight into Virginia. Eventually, the South will invade Kentucky first, and then the Union will start to use it, and the river systems like the Ohio River goes along its northern border and connects into the Mississippi. And they're able to use that for their war efforts. So they were good like staging areas. So it was very strategically important to keep them. Also, the border states kind of like were a gauge of public opinion. If Lincoln kept the border states, it looked like the war was going well. But if the border states would go to the Confederate side, it would look like the North was losing the war. So as long as you can keep the border states in the Union, it looks like the war is going good and people are going to support it. But if you lose the border states, it might look like the war is going bad and people may not support it as much anymore. So Lincoln is going to be very cautious with the border states. One of the things that causes Lincoln to be very slow to push for emancipation is to not alienate these border states. So they were like the measure of public opinion, important for population, important for strategic positioning, important for public opinion. They even had some industry there, some manufacturing. So the war has begun, and what we'll see next time